Okay, welcome back, everybody. Yes, I see that the attendees are popping into the room now. I see Cindy there. Bridget Manley, thank you so much. Everybody that's joining us today. Appreciate you being here and helping us close out the event. This has been an absolutely incredible week. The messages I've been receiving through email and through AirMeet and on our Slack channel have been absolutely fantastic. I'm just absolutely just so happy about how things have turned out. Total, we had about 362 people register for the event overall, and I think that's great. We had under 300 last year, so for the second year, that's really, really good. So congrats, everybody. And thanks again for the team, the volunteer team that helped put this one together, all the speakers and sponsors that we had. It's been great. But now to close things out, so excited. This was kind of a late add to the agenda overall, but I'm so happy that Bridget was able to connect with Kimfer and Terry for this one. Let me give you their bios real quick. I have something shortened on the side that I can read out. Kimfer Flanery-Rye is the founder and principal consultant for My Kimisms, LLC, a social enterprise focused on IDEA. Inclusion equals diversity plus equity plus accessibility. Love that. To build culture from the inside out and to address systemic issues we must tackle for the inequities within organizational systems. That's fantastic. Kimfer is a seasoned professional with 20 plus years of experience and a diverse background across art, design, communication, training, digital marketing, brand strategy, executive leadership, design thinking, and organizational development. That's pretty much everything, Kimfer. I don't know what's left. Sales, maybe? I don't know. She's also an adjunct professor teaching creativity and innovation for MBA students and has her MBA in executive leadership. And Kimfer, I was really interested in the Learn-a-Palooza conference a couple of months ago and I saw that you were one of the, I think, were you keynoting that one? I remember seeing you on the list. I'm like, ooh, who is Kimfer? So I'm so glad that you're here. And then Terry Rice, Executive VP of People Operations and Experience at Lions Plus Tigers. Terry is the Executive Vice President of People Operations and Experience at Lions Plus Tigers and an advocate for inclusive future of work practices. He's a builder and innovator with a background in a wide range of industries, including cruise ships, tech startups, and even a stint with a local circus company. In his current role, Terry leads people care and development, talent acquisition, diversity and inclusion, and consulting, service, and delivery. I am so glad that you're here to close out the event for us, Kim and Terry. I'm going to go and hide myself from the screen, let you take it away for DEI, Beyond Traditional Learning and Development.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Louise.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. Kimfer, it's nice to be here with you today. Nice to be with all of you here today.
You too, Terry. Always a pleasure.
Always a pleasure. Little sneak peek. Kimfer has been consulting to Lions and Tigers for a number of years now. I think we're going on our third year working together. So I am a client. Lions and Tigers is a client of My Kimisms. And so I'm just really chance to chat with you a little bit today. I've got a bunch of questions for you. I'll be watching the chat so we can look for questions and comments in the chat as well. But thanks for this opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is, for those of you that are joining, keynotes can be kind of an interesting thing, closing or opening. And I roped Terry in here saying like, hey, let's make this be a conversation. These folks have been in it probably to win it for the last week. And so we thought rather than, just seeing my face and lecturing at you, that it might be nice to listen to a conversation and really get deeper into this area.
All right. So let's dig in. So my first question for you, Kimfer, the title of this conversation today is DEI, Beyond Learning and Development. Can you tell me more about what this means, what this title means to you, going beyond learning and development?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to share a slide here with you all. So the way that I think about when it comes to DEI is that there was definitely a line in the sand. And I think all of you are going to understand this, right? There was pre-George Floyd's murder and post-George Floyd's murder. And DI was an area in industry. It was already been in an established field, but I would say a lot of folks within that space were really looking more at workshops and trainings and things like that, right? Very few of us before then were actually looking at it from a systems and structural change in alignment. So my big thing is that you have to do this in a parallel. Yes, personal journeys and training and understanding of the language. We all know that we all probably have gone through bias trainings by now and privilege and what it means to learn about racism, microaggressions, and all of that. That's great for internal learning for sure. And you need that to bring that with you. However, for organizations to change, you do have to look at organizational culture. You have to look at organizational systems, which includes policies, procedures. Is it part of your business strategy? And all of that is needed really to make those systemic changes that you want out there, to do it in a systems way within your organization. And so that's what I talk about when I say it's more than beyond. It's beyond traditional learning and development, because you can't just train yourself out of the scenarios and systems that have been created that has been inequitable.
Yeah, I think this visual that you've shared here is great, as it lays out both the strategy level and the operational level. For the purposes of this conversation and for really deeply understanding the levels that this work happens at, I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about what the alternative looks like. What does it look like when you don't see this work happening at that systems level in an organization? If in a position working in learning and development or management or leadership or HR, what are the sort of cues that somebody might observe that would indicate that maybe this isn't happening at that systems level?
Yeah. So here's what I like to call the maturity model here. Okay. So I would say a lot of organizations were probably in that level 1, level 2, definitely a lot in level 1, that like I said, that line in the sand. And then what happened really after 2020 and Black Lives Matter came into like full swing. Obviously, Black Lives Matter has been around for much longer than that. People are really getting into the obligation stage, right? You're expected to do something. So that's where a lot of that promises came out, a lot of statements and performative actions came in. And around that time is when also organizations, probably those of you on this line with us, if you're in learning and development, probably also got these requests. Hey, come and do training, come and do workshops. If you're part of the learning and development team, work with the HR team to make sure we can do some kind of a training session for our organization, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So really, when we're not doing all of this in where you want to look at like in that action and moving through in that 4 and 5, you're really looking at a surface level of, again, really in that, is it performative? Why? What are you doing in that sense? And if you're doing it in that level of surface level and definitely in a performative level, you can do so much more harm to the organization. And that's the part that's challenging, is how do you move forward without creating that harm for the organization? And that whole one and done, we all know this. Do the thing, check it off. We did the bias training. And then the organization is left with, well, then what? What are we doing after that? What is that? So I think that's really the areas in which I look at it from a DEI, and what is that alternative people do? There's a lot of the training options.
Mm-hmm. So I know that you use design thinking quite a bit in your work as you help clients like Lions and Tigers, where I'm at, and other clients that you work with as you support them moving up through these levels. For this group, let's start. Part question here. Can you start by just giving us a quick What's the 30-second, if someone's not familiar with it, what does design thinking mean? And then I'll ask you a follow-up about how that's integrated into your practice.
Yeah, for sure. I'm going to, before we do that, I want to make sure that I get a chance to just touch back really quick, Terry. So
Sure.
when I was talking about the organizational change there and that alternative, one thing that I love for this audience to do is take a look at this. I want you to take a look at this. It's based on the Kubler-Ross change curve. And for those of you probably familiar with that, is really has to do with grief and loss. What I've been able to do throughout my experience with working with clients and individuals, surveys, you name it, this is something that I've noticed within individuals typically how this moves. So you're really looking at it as a change curve. And what happened after George Floyd's murder is that we got into that state where this could be a lifetime journey. Everyone was asked to do it in a really, 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 really quick time frame, right? And so one of the things, again, alternatively, individually, these are some of the things that you need to also audit yourself. I do a lot of organizational audits, but individual audits are just as important. And so I think it's important for you all to see, just like that really the maturity model in an organizational level that you saw. This is also a maturity level and an individual level. So I just wanted to bring that up and have an opportunity for everyone to take a look at it and do an honest assessment of yourself. Like, where are you really? Like, really, where are you? Right. And that may look different depending on maybe the community. So you might be in a certain level overall, but maybe the way that you support or understand or being a good ally or a leader for the disabilities, right, community might be in a different scale than you might be with the Asian community, et cetera. So I wanted to touch on that really quick before we move to what design thinking is all about. Because with design thinking, it's a human-centered design process. And so the reason why it's important to know that is because it starts with empathy. And this is why I love using design thinking. Partly because I am a creative at heart. I've been an executive and an executive creative director for agencies in the past. So I kind of live and breathe within that design thinking model. But it's not just for designers. It's not just for creatives. You can really leverage that framework because of the fact that it's a human-centered framework, and it starts with empathy. Like, how are you going to really work within a system to combat that if you don't understand and able to define what some of those things are happening within communities that we want to serve or your organization that you want to support, and really work through. And it looks like a linear process here, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But the thing about this, it's an iterative process. So you're constantly moving in and out of these groups and redefining and going back to ideating. Maybe you're testing, you need to come back and go, oh my gosh, let's go back and really talk with the folks out there so you can empathize again.
Yeah. This is a really great graphic. I'm curious, as you work with clients, as you work with organizations to help move them through this process, I wonder, can you talk a little bit about what the sort of response is? Is it something that becomes that's intuitive once it's shared? Is it something that you experience a level of resistance or have to do some education and sort of like consensus building? How does that look when you are doing your work?
Oh, great question. Actually, I think, because of the fact that there is a framework to start, it makes it fairly, I think people understand it. Once they see this process, they go, oh, okay, that makes sense. We start here and then we move forward. And on top of that, what I end up doing is I talk to clients in addition to the design thinking process is really looking at it from these 3 areas, right? So again, we're looking at structure. We're looking at how to change things from systems perspective. So we can't get to that. So if you think about that process is the framework, this is the stuff that we're looking at. We're opening the doors, the curtains, looking up underneath your sinks or whatever you're thinking about in the organization. We're looking at all of this because ultimately what it comes down to it is the fact that it's about the culture. So with the culture, I look at and work with the organization really to say, hey, if we're going to start with empathy, guess what we're going to do? We're going to talk with your people first, right? So we're going to talk with your people. What are they thinking about? What's happening? And you've gone through this process, Terry, right? We look at what does the executive team think about and what happens with your mid-level managers and what's happening with your individual contributors and folks that are down there. And then we really look at the delta. Like where are the deltas in where there's misalignment? Where are the gaps in what the perception of leadership is versus what's happening at the front line and everyone in between there. And so especially they're the ones who are actually enacting your culture. And so without them, it doesn't really exist, right? So and the other thing is we look at your brand and people tend to confuse brand with, oh, marketing, it's the words or whatnot. But really, brand is where your mission, vision, values actually live, right? That's where your internal brand as well as external brand. And that is what defines your culture. So for us to like talk to the people about enacting that culture, like what is it that was set up in the first place, right? So how is that aligned? Is that aligned? Is it value aligned to what you want to and show up? And that's aligned to DEI ideas or idea practices. And then, of course, that third area, because we all love a trifecta and we all love a Venn diagram, you've got your policies and procedures that you have to look at that. That's what supports that culture. So that way, when you say, hey, here's our values, but our policies and procedures over here is like anti to that values, well, then that's not going to work. It's going to, then people are going to enact your culture differently, right? And it would just go in a way that without your intent and approval. So that's what we're looking at as well.
I remember going through this with you as a client and you sharing that you wanted to take a look behind the curtains of the organization. And I thought that makes sense. Of course, why wouldn't you? But the comprehensiveness of what we ended up doing together was really quite remarkable. And I look back at, it built our foundation, but we must have shared hundreds of documents with you, from onboarding documents to offer letter documents to parental leave policies. I mean, everything went through this sort of deep review. And so it's just, I'm looking back at this slide now and I'm remembering us going through this work together. It was definitely comprehensive.
Yeah, and for us, like, if you don't mind me sharing a little, is that with Lions and Tigers, for those of you, just to get some more specifics, after it was, I think in the beginning phase was about 3 months worth of, again, talking with your people, you looking at all the information, et cetera, and the audit that came out. Again, it's an iterative process. So there were some things we would consider, low-hanging fruit or whatnot could get integrated right away. You don't need to wait until like 3 months before you can do any work. But by then we had a pretty good list. We had 72 items that came out. That was that we can work on. And it took you, I think, the first year to get through even 32 items. Again, this isn't a checklist, folks. That's not what I'm talking about. We're talking about super comprehensive. And as Terry stated, looking at policies from an HR perspective, but we also looked at your value and shifted because of it. So that way you can really integrate in a way that was supportive of your existing culture and the culture you want it to become. And so again, it's looking at all of these aspects and intertwining them, and not, hey, if you did a workshop, which you all did too, you did learning series and all of that as a parallel path. But if you only did that, how is it getting integrated like this ultimately?
Yeah. And it's changed so much how we operate as an organization, even down to things like who we elevate on social media, who we engage with, who do we comment on, whose content do we reshare, what voices do we use our platform to amplify. It's that's sort of an external example, but it just everything and how we operate as an organization shifted as we went through this work. Okay, Kimfer, I think that sometimes it's really helpful when we talk about this to talk about what it does, what it looks like when it's not going well. I think that it can be really helpful as a learning mechanism to talk through some of the pitfalls, some of the traps. So I'd like to talk a little bit about why DEI work fails in organizations as a way to learn. So let's start there. In your experience going through this work as a practitioner, what are some of those really common traps or really common pitfalls that you see in organizations that either derail or do harm as folks are trying to do DEI work?
Yeah, so I think I'm gonna start with Bridget's question there too, right? So, some of the things that I see where some of those pitfalls happen is when there is that huge disconnect, right, from executives to the front line, which is okay actually, if the organization is committed, right? So they're like, oh wow, so there's that big delta, we are going to work through it, right? So that's a positive, that would be a positive scenario. What happens on the other side is when it's in that performative state. So for example, I am usually very good about value alignment with clients before I start engagements with them, but you don't always know all the details until you really get into it. So, for example, I had a client where ultimately it appeared to be where the leadership was in alignment. They wanted this and they actually put budget to it and all of that. What I found out though was that they were getting pressure from their board of directors, right? And they were getting pressure from their individual contributors. But that executive leadership team really didn't believe in it. They were in it to make sure that they check the box. So the kind of harm that comes in that scenario is that it appears like the organization is committed. We went through the auditing process and some of that. And then this is always where the rubber meets the road for me, is when I find out from organizations where they're like, oh, for this particular organization, they said, okay, well, we've shifted our priorities and we want you, and that was myself and the people leader in that organization, for you to continue doing this work with everyone, but the executive team is no longer prioritizing this. What? Like what? Like how is that even, like how do you even, that's harmful for the organization. One, that means there's no value, there's no alignment as to what's priority, right, from the organization. And it made the statement like, you go ahead, right, you do the thing, but we have more important things to do by doing this thing over here. But especially since we got the check mark from the board, it looks like to the board, we went through an assessment, did the thing, you try to do the thing, right? You do the thing, but we're not necessarily going to support you from that forward, right? So that's one of the pitfalls. Another one is when organizations don't put budget to it or don't think about how to do this with an expert practitioner, is that you end up asking your employees to do things that they're not, that's not their area of expertise, right? So I always like to say, since I was a previous marketer, is like asking someone to like, hey, why don't you take over the demand generation of like really looking at data-driven marketing? I know you're in HR, but why don't you take care of that? Right. And so that kind of happens all the time. I don't know how often I've had organizations where the people who are often the BIPOC community, right? Black, Indigenous, people of color, people who might have visible disabilities or willing to share their invisible disabilities, various other things, say, hey, because you're part of that community, guess what? Why don't you represent us and do all the things, and ask them to do all of that labor for free, and teach something that is not their area of expertise. And then on top of that, they have to represent like literally like, hey, Kimfer, why don't you represent all of Asian people? I'm like, there are 48 countries. I do not know or understand all of those cultures, let alone, what is alignment there. And so because of that, there were tons of conversations that were happening in organizations without a good facilitator or understanding what it means to really think about DI. They would watch a movie, they would listen to a podcast, they would do a book, whatever it is, and then they would come back and have these conversations which were fraught with with good intentioned but misguided, and conversations where it was really harmful for people inside those conversations. And that, I mean, to me, like, ooh, heartbreaking, right? To watch that kind of thing happen. So those, I would say, like, there's quite a few, but those are some of the things that it can really go
Sure.
sideways.
Okay, so I'm looking at the time here. I want us to answer one more question that's in the Q&A section, which I'll read to you in a moment, and then we'll do a quick moment of individual reflection, and then we'll come back for some closing thoughts and a Q&A. So this next question that came from the audience here is: an organizational level DEI maturity model assumes that an organization is homogenous, but we know that to be not true. How do you recognize and cater for individual, team, departmental level cultures when moving along different DEI continuums? That's a great question.
Oh my gosh. Great question. So here's an interesting information for you. So there's this idea of microcultures, and some of you might be familiar with that. So if we think about out in the society, we have, culture, and then it's societal culture, subcultures is what's called. In organizations, they're called microcultures. And every manager, so just want you to listen to it, every people manager creates a microculture if they intend to or not, oftentimes unintentionally. Okay, so there's that part. However, people who are intentional or try to be intentional, what you're trying to do is align to the big, hopefully, if the organization's is, on that maturity model, you are trying to look at the organization. What is that strategy to get there? And allowing each of those individuals and teams to move in a way that makes sense. Because what you want to do is you don't want to really hold back too much the people that have moved forward quickly, but you do want to bring the organization with you, because there is also harm that happens to both sides when you have people moving too fast. So one of the advice that I usually give to organizations that have a DEI committee or an equity team, or where you've got like those really passionate people that are constantly keeping the organization in check about how they should do it faster or more, all of that. There are moments where that group, that passionate group, can actually also cause harm to the organization because they're moving too fast, right? So there's a difference in which you need to think about, like, where are you as an individual and how do you then help the organization move, right? So you could be in a level 5 as an individual, but the organization is at a level 2. Then how do you then help, being one of those people with all that information and knowledge and passion, know that organizational change takes time, and not expecting that organization to be a level 5 along with you and demand it right now, because that demand can cause a lot more friction. And I don't mean you shouldn't have friction to move and change, because change always means friction. I just mean in a way that can be harmful for everyone else. Mm-hmm. So hopefully that kind of answers that question.
Yeah, it's interesting too to think about how that DEI council or that committee, whatever the individual organization structure is, can help support that and help sort of it can be involved in helping to set the pace for the organization to ensure that all teams are moving forward and making progress.
Absolutely.
Okay, Kimfer, why don't we do a quick activity? I think it's on our next slide here, and we'll do it with, we'll have folks do it individually. Do you want to talk us through this self-evaluation activity?
Yeah, I think it's really important. Reflection is important. Really thinking about yourself and your organization critically is important, because DI is work. It doesn't have to be like just dreadful work. I don't want you to think that. I mean, people think of DEI, oh, it's so serious, but it doesn't have to be, but it is important to really think about it yourself, right? So I'd love for you to think about this and spend another, a minute or two and about these two specific questions. If you work for an organization, and maybe you're a consultant, I'm not sure, but if you work for an organization, does your organization have an integrated systems change, right? Or a DEI strategy that integrates the parallel path and not just individual learning and development? Do they have that? I'd love for you to use chat if you're feeling comfortable to say yes or no around that. And then for you to be able to share, if you're willing, again, what pitfalls have you seen within your organization or yourself as a learning and development individual while trying to implement DEI in whatever form for you? Love for you to, again, sit with it, think about it, and would love it if you're willing to share.
Okay, so we're going to take a minute or two to let folks do some quiet reflection. Before we send you off to do that, as Kimfer mentioned, if you're willing to share or have some your reactions or comments, please drop those in the chat. And then when we come back from this, we're going to move into a Q&A. So if you've got questions that are burning on your mind, go ahead and feel free to start to drop those in the Q&A section, and we'll work through those when we come back.
And we're gonna quietly, I think, watch you happen.
Sip some water.
Yeah. This is when I wish that we prepared some music for everyone, so you can have some mood music while you're thinking and doing your self-evaluation.
I'm thinking about these questions too, thinking about the question of my own organization or the organization I work within today, and how our parallel journeys have evolved where we are today, and then also still seeing, I think we're dedicated to this work, but we still see pitfalls, and we still run into challenges while implementing our own DEI work. So I'm doing a little moment of self-evaluation in this moment too.
Yeah, and that's the thing about, I think, with committed organizations, we can make those moments, right? And if you don't mind me sharing, Terry, we realized in year 2 that the leadership team went through leadership journey, because there is something to be said about leadership having their own moments to go through this. And we had parallel training also. This is along with all the systems work. And then we had individual contributors going through all their training. And then they were in the year 2 of all of that and realized, what did we do to continue on the leadership learning journey? And so we adjusted that and reintroduced additional learning journeys for the leadership. So that way, I mean, you were all in those individual learning journeys obviously as well, but there is something to be said about, as leadership, there's different conversations that can be had. Yeah.
I think that's it's such a good point, and it's particularly important for our organization, as we went from a primarily white leadership team when we started this work to a much more representative leadership team today, and going back and doing work collectively as the representation of the leadership team has changed throughout this our journey. I think it's so important to have those moments together.
Yeah.
Okay. That was about 2 minutes. So let's take a look. Feel free to add any reactions in the chat. And then again, we're going to jump into a Q&A here in just a moment. So if you've got any questions, you can drop those into the Q&A. But Kimfer, I'm going to just point to a comment in the chat here. I think it's from Bridget. I think my biggest challenge implementing DEI with my clients is knowing what sources to rely upon for my own self-education.
Oh, good question. So for me, one of the first things I would say is that follow folks on LinkedIn, on Instagram, and wherever that are DEI practitioners. We are pretty notorious for wanting to share the kind of resources that are available, and more than happy to do so, right? And I think for me, the folks that I tend to follow are or know where to look for are there are folks that are known as DEI educators, right? So I always look at practitioners, educators. Sometimes they're two different things. Educators are oftentimes the ones that are really works they are professors, right? They're doctorates and all of that. They do tons of research. They do research papers and books and etc. But I always like to pair that up with practitioners, because there's theory sometimes on an educational level, and then there's practitioners that are out there. And we got to love the Google. We can do a good Google search for DI practitioners. So rather than looking for articles, maybe start with practitioners and then see what kind of resources that they're sharing. That's a kind of a flipping the script on that. Also stay with reputable sources, right? Even though they're also oftentimes, I would say, white power structures. However, they're going to have also the reputable sources. So if you follow Harvard Business Review, for instance, they have tons of articles around DI. What I end up doing is taking an article, see who wrote it, and then I go to them and find out what else they wrote or who else they follow, et cetera, et cetera. So I would say look for the practitioners, look for the educators, rather than just looking for the article. Hopefully that makes sense.
Okay, I want to close us out here with one more question. So we have made the case throughout the last 40 minutes together that this work, to be really durable, needs to happen at a systems level throughout the organization. And it requires this executive team or leadership team commitment to resources and to doing this work well. For folks who are in the room and they are thinking, okay, we hear you, we've made the case. What are your tips, or what guidance would you give for starting a conversation in an organization that moves DEI work from programmatic and learning to that sort of deep systems level change that we've been talking about today?
Yeah, I think I have a little bit of a depend on where you are in the organization. Just a quick tips. So if you think about it, I have this thing called do the work. It's a hashtag. I mean, it's other people use that. But if you want to do the work, here are some ways to look at it. Why is doing DI systems change important to you? Maybe you don't think it's important. I would assume that you think it's important. You're at this event. And so then, the idea is why? Why is it important to you? What's driving that for you? What is the driver for you, right? And is it intrinsically motivated, or is it by external pressure? So those first three questions, I recommend to everyone really taking the time to answer that clearly for yourself. And then there are some ways that you can look at it from each of these areas. Are you an organizational leader? You might be an L&D leader and an organizational leader, right? There's obviously, we have multiple hats that we might wear. So one of the things that I always like to say is ask yourself, are we as a leadership team prioritizing DEI during our budgeting process and our strategy process in the way that we think about business? Because to make it successful, leadership has to be on board. You have to be on board. You really do have to make it a business strategy. If not, the resource allocations, the way that people think about priorities and all of that it won't be in alignment, right? So it's really important that is a realization there. If you're within the HR organization, I know oftentimes learning and development tend to fall in there, and maybe you are, maybe you aren't. Have you really audited your policies and procedures with a DI lens? One of the things that that many of us, I think even folks in HR, I've had many conversations about old school HR, really administration and policy driven, has sometimes a conflict with DI. because that traditional model is how do we, yes, support employees, but how do we hold that policies and administration and follow the rules, versus DEI is coming in and saying, hey, that policies and that procedure needs to be changed. So how do we help you change that? So that auditing process, I think, is really important. For those of you in the learning and development, are you treating DEI training as a compliance training? Oh my goodness, how often, I don't know, you have been asked to do this, maybe even, or seen it in organizations where like, oh, we did harassment training, boom, DEI done. I'm like, no, that's not it. That's like legal. Those are legal compliance policy, training. But are you really looking at it from beyond that? And have you vetted some of that through a DI practitioner? Are you working with them and partnering with them to make that happen? Right?
All right, Kimfer, it is always a pleasure to sit down and chat with you and hear about your experience and your expertise in this space. Thank you so much for letting me ask you a few questions today.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Are there questions that folks need or have, or yeah?
Hey there. So, could you respond to Cindy's comment? I think this is really interesting. Oops, sorry, I'm totally slouching here. Pitfalls for us, Cindy is asking, pitfalls for us have been challenging leaders to commit to the learning. We don't want to mandate DEIB training. We want all participants to actively commit to the learning and commitment to change from the top, not compliant.
Absolutely, Cindy. So here's a really interesting thing, right? Again, there's a multiple levels, so I'll talk about it in two ways. One, hopefully you have an organization that's committed, like Terry's organization, where it is a requirement for leaders and people managers, because it aligns to their values, right? So their values state diversity, inclusion, belonging is part of their organizational need. If that is truly the case as a leader, it's like an antithesis of that by not being mandatory to take these training as part of your leadership training. Almost like not as your DEI training, but as part of your leadership training. However, with individuals, you do need to leave that. Obviously, the more mandated it becomes, it can also, again, hold people like on the other side. They'll resist really hard and actually create that bigger friction of people like almost going the opposite direction by trying to mandate that. What happens in organizations where you have leadership team that's like, yeah, right? We all know that, right? Like, yeah. With that, that's where it gets, like you said, it's challenging because you've got some leaders that are probably proponents of it and some that are like, leave it or take it. I don't believe in it, whatever it is. There's something to be said for internal pressure. It's like being a teenager in some ways, right? And you get a lot of peer pressure. So what you want to look at and think about is working with your leadership team, especially if you're in-house folks, your sponsors, your champions, the people that are in that group within that leadership team, having strategy sessions in where you really leverage peer pressure, positive peer pressure to get people, even if it's just kind of like bringing them along in maybe a little bit more disgruntled way, but in a way that's consistently and continuously creating space for hopefully safe conversations as to why are they not. Again, it's a lot more helpful if you're able to tie it to your company values and believe in those values, then that's the best way to bring it in and making it a leadership requirement and journey. So hopefully that helps a little bit.
No, that's great. That's great. I do like Cindy's other post earlier where Cindy was saying we are a work in progress at her organization. We have a new DEI manager role, also an in-house psychologist. Year one has been one of evaluation, understanding the culture systems in place, bringing DEIB content to the org and evaluation. And now year 2 will be more of an active change process to embed DEIB checks within our systems, processes, and engagements.
Yeah, that's fantastic that your organization has committed to those two roles. I know I see benefit from Lions and Tigers. They also have a psychologist in their roster, and I know myself and that individual. We often work together in thinking about how do we think about one psychological safety and all of that. But I think bringing in the mental behaviors. And then I also do a lot of DEI around neuroscience, things like that. And so I think those are really important aspects. And that's really phenomenal, Cindy, that your organization is have even invested in that. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, Cindy, actually, I don't remember Milo, what exactly his role was there at Cindy's organization, but he spoke here at this event last year and was absolutely fantastic. He really, really incredible. All right, and let's see if anybody has any more questions at all. Taruna always has incredible comments. See, Taruna said, as learning designers, we need to do DEI training the right way and in parallel must ensure that we design DEI forward learning experiences. We need to wear both hats.
Absolutely. Yeah. And again, this is, I will say it over and over because for those of you in learning and development, you are in horizontal, right? You have to know a lot of different things to bring those different items to your organization. People focused, obviously, but it's still horizontal. So how are you then partnering with DEI practitioners, internal or external, to make sure that you're bringing in DEI training in a way that's appropriate? And then as a learning and development individual, when you see opportunities, are you speaking up saying, hey, this has to be more than about training? We really need to look at it from our organization and here are some things, or here's some people, here's ways that we should address it along with those things that we do, right?
Nice. Of course, I'm just all learning about this, total newbie, but are there specific ways that you can make sure that you're in concert working with HR on these activities? Is there any specific instances that you can share about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So oftentimes for me, when I get hired on from organizations, I often work with, if it's a smaller organization with the C levels, or VP levels, and then also if it's in a large enterprise, whoever is the head of the organizational the business unit, right? And one of the first things that happens is that being in really sync with the HR team, because of the fact that they own a lot of policies and procedures, development, and all of that within the organization. And so that way we are doing it as a partnership and looking at it from, again, systems, looking at it from policy and procedures, not as like, hey, you HR person, you're not doing things right. Right? No one likes to see that. It's not about them. They also learn how their structure is and what their rules are. So then having these conversations and say, love that. Love all of these things that you've been able to do. Let's now put this lens on it and let's see how we can then do more to serve our organization and our people. I don't know. I'm trying to think. I have yet to have an organization where the HR team was resistant. Yeah. Because really, we're also, as a DI practitioner, you're also trying to help their job and their work to be smoother as well.
Yes, absolutely. Wow. Okay, I'm looking to see if there are any more questions in the QA area. I don't have anything else. I want to thank you so much, Kimfer, for doing this. Wow, we need to get your name out there. So if at all for our little community, if we can help share anything you have, please feel free to send it over. Thank you so much for helping support our event. And Terry, it was great having you help moderate and just ask those questions. They're absolutely fantastic. It was really neat to kind of see sort of, like your best practice, sort of talking about use case stuff and great session overall and great way to close out our event this week. So thank you so much.
Oh my gosh, thank you. This has been a pleasure. Really great to be able to help you close out this week. I hope you learned lots. So
excellent. All right. And I'm just looking at your slide here. We got your QR code. You're on Instagram, mykimisms.com. All right. I'm going to have to promote that in our newsletter. And yeah, it looks like we're all good. All right, everyone. Have a great weekend. Thanks again for participating in the event. Recordings are available pretty much immediately. Just give it a little bit for this one to process. You can go back, take notes. The slides were incredible. I loved all the visuals for this one. I'm definitely going back myself and sharing with some of my colleagues. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and close this out. Have a great weekend, everybody. And we'll see you next time. Thanks a lot.